Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome once again to the monthly workshop that is organized by CSH and CPR. We've had this workshop in hybrid mode for some time, and so we will go in and out of online and offline and hybrid modes till things settle down. But we're always very happy that more people can join us in the online mode. Today we are with us is Supriya Roy Chaudhary, and she's going to speak about informal work in urban exclusion, sort of based on her book, which came out last year, The City of Shadows, Slums and Informal Work in Bangalore. Supriya is currently visiting professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore, and we were hoping to have her with us in Delhi for the workshop. But we're also very happy to have her online speaking from Bangalore. The abstract and more about Supriya is already with you in your emailer. So without more delay, I'd hand over to Supriya. We will be taking questions both in the Q&A box, and if you're not comfortable with that, you can leave questions in the chat as well, and we'll take them up after Supriya has spoken. So over to you, Supriya, and welcome once more to the CPR CSH workshop.
Thank you. Am I visible?
Yes, you're visible and audible.
Yeah. So thanks very much for the invitation. And again, once again, sorry not to be there for the offline presentation, but I'd like to also particularly thank Mukta for organizing this. I will be drawing on some recent research that we have done on global supply chain workers in Bangalore, as well as service sector workers in Bangalore. Actually, not just Bangalore, but all over Karnataka. But I would also partially be touching on some of the findings presented, which have been presented in my book, which Mukta mentioned earlier, which came out last year. Now, urban poverty and urbanization of poverty are widely used concepts, and globalization is associated with the generation of enormous wealth in cities globally. Now, cities have actually been the main generators and consumers of wealth during this period. And I'm not going to give any facts and figures about that, it's widely known. But despite the enormous accumulation process, large numbers of people actually remain in poverty or become poor in cities. So currently, about 1 billion people, or 1/3 of the world's urban population, live in slums. And the greatest concentration is in Asia and Africa. Now, very briefly, there have been 3 dominant approaches to policymaking on urban poverty. And again, this would be known to many of you, so I would just very briefly use it as a sort of a starting point. The first is that already disadvantaged social groups, defined in terms of caste, race, gender, or community, are particularly vulnerable. Second is that poor rural migrants come to cities with very little resources, skills, or social capital. They join the urban informal, low-paid workforce. And urban poverty is, in this sense, a carryover of rural poverty. This is a dominant and widely shared viewpoint amongst the international agencies like the World Bank, the ADB, so on and so forth. Finally, increasingly, the spatial dimension of poverty of cities has emerged as central in poverty analysis. Slums, informal settlements, fragile self-constructed tenements in the city's peripheries are seen to be kind of generators of poverty and which sustain poor people. These genres of analysis are tied to a fairly hegemonic policy position, which draws on a broadly defined welfarist approach, which is that social policy must target vulnerable groups by providing specific items. These could be human resources, health and education, civic infrastructure, water, sanitation, etc., and affordable housing. And currently, as we all know, housing is one of the biggest policy agendas. Now, this broadly welfarist approach has been criticized, but not substantively challenged. For example, David Satterwhite, who is a well-known development scholar and is associated with many of the international development institutions, has described housing schemes for the urban poor as putting a roof over their poverty. This is kind of an implicit criticism, but not an explicit challenge of this very, very dominant and hegemonic position. Now, and the question, of course, is, can one talk about welfare without at the same time talking about work? So the work versus welfare contradiction has been discussed in many forums. I myself have written on it, and we can come back to this in the end during question answer. Now, this is sort of a broad background as far as my own work is concerned. In the course of many years of field research with underprivileged communities in Bangalore and labor in different cities, I have actually found that the absence of organized sector factory jobs and a proliferation of informal jobs, mainly in services, holds the key to understanding urban vulnerability. So informality is actually sort of central to the analysis which I offer. Now, I think it's important to understand that informality is widely used in the literature on cities across the world. Saskia Sassen, for example, coined the term global cities, which are hypermobile, technologically advanced, driven by finance capital. But even in these cities like London, Tokyo, and New York, she saw the emergence of pockets of marginality. Non-expert jobs are performed here by unskilled, often illegal immigrants. So there is an economic and spatial polarization driven by immigration and lack of skills and characterized by informal work. Guy Standing of the ILO had coined the word precariat some years back, which is kind of a life of unstable labor marked by temporary, flexible, contractual work, characteristic of financial IT services as well, but also increasingly found in other professions such as teaching, law, and administration. So from what I understand of these perspectives is that informality is going to be with us, and we need to work around it rather than kind of wishing it away or doing away with it, because it's pretty much part of the way economies have developed in recent decades. However, it is really very important to highlight that in Western economies or in other industrially advanced countries, informality is cushioned to some extent by universal school education, still existing robust welfare systems in Western Europe, a living minimum wage, and regulated working conditions. In cities of the global South, vulnerable communities are not only those who are attached to the new economy, though on unfavorable conditions. For example, workers in lower rungs of services or migrant labor in global supply chains, but also the much larger numbers who remain confined to traditional unskilled work. For example, construction, head load bearing, road cleaning, domestic work, and so on. These urban livelihoods highlight irregular and unprotected incomes above everything else. So informality is actually a very broad term, important to understand that it reproduces itself very differently, and its specificity in different contexts is something that needs to be underlined. Now coming to Bangalore, which is my current case study. The contrasts to wealth and poor or the wealth and poverty are not very different in Bangalore than in most cities of the global South. However, what makes Bangalore somewhat more interesting is that during the last 3 or 4 decades, the city's economy has been transformed completely. Post-independence, Bangalore had a kind of quiet affluence, one could say, A large number of state enterprises provided comfortable campuses for their lifetime employees and their families. Retired bureaucrats' bungalows nestled in a restful garden city. All of this has actually changed from the 1980s towards becoming a very strident materiality with IT and ITES at the center of the city's growth, driven by private capital and manifested in world-class residences, leisure and entertainment, global commerce and business. And importantly, a cosmopolitan and knowledge class now sort of virtually towers over the city's landscape. So this glitter is unfortunately shadowed by the presence of a large urban underclass. Petty traders, casual daily wage earners, contract workers, garment export workers, app-based workers, who remain excluded from the city's wealth-generating structures and channels. Now, Bangalore was actually a leader in public sector enterprises. The largest number of public sector enterprises were found in Bangalore post-independence. And a very large and deep small-scale industry sector had grown as annex to the public sector manufacturing companies. In other words, small-scale sector sort of grew on the basis of as ancillaries to the public sectors and depended on orders from the public sector companies, particularly engineering industries. The growth of a robust working class was seen during the first few decades of independence, as well as an urban lower and middle class. And all of these categories sort of grew on the back of this public sector and SSI ecosystem. Since the 1980s, the PSUs have significantly wrapped up, and we have periodically charted this decline of PSUs in Bangalore. So wrapped up their operations through partial closures, privatizations, and so on. So the dual pathway to organized sector factory jobs, namely PSUs and a small-scale industry sector, completely dried up and left a vacuum that became the blind spot of economic and employment policy. So the question then is, what happened to working classes in the city? And this question probably needs to be contextualized a bit. Karnataka, so Bangalore is Karnataka's capital city. Karnataka has always been ahead of the national GDP growth rate. In 2017-18, the national GDP growth rate was 6.5, Karnataka's was 8.5. This is just an example. This has been led by IT and ITES. 39% share in India's electronic and software exports is held by Karnataka. And 76% of Karnataka's exports comes from the IT and ITES sector. So a consistently high growth record, impressive menu of modern state-of-the-art industries, rising exports, particularly from the 1990s onwards, characterizes Karnataka's political economy. However, the poverty ratio, which has been at 21% according to 2011 census, places Karnataka at 20th position in the list of 35 states, close to the national average. And poverty in Karnataka actually continues to be highest and well-being the lowest among the southern states. Now, I do need to show you So this shows you the percentage of population below poverty line in Karnataka compared to other southern states. This is 2011-12. And you can clearly see that Karnataka's poverty ratio is much higher than Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and even Andhra Pradesh. Similarly, in ranking in HDI and other indicators, as compared to other southern states, Karnataka's position is 10th. Tamil Nadu is 1, Kerala is 1, and Tamil Nadu is 6th. So one can clearly see that there is a certain duality in the state's growth trajectory. While growth has been fast and impressive, there is an exclusivist nature to this growth, and low human development indicators point towards inadequate and less state attention to the state sectors. But perhaps, more importantly, I think one needs to draw attention currently to what is currently the employment situation or the employment structure in the state. In India as a whole, the share of agriculture in GDP has declined, but agriculture continues to be the largest employer. And this is such a very well-known phenomenon that one doesn't need to elaborate on it. Agriculture currently has about 42% of employment share. Now, this again has been pointed to by many scholars that when a large number of people remain tied to agriculture, despite declining productivity and profits, despite successive agrarian crises, this obviously means that there is lack of opportunities in other sectors. And the Indian economy's growth, I'm going to be very brief about this, it's not my domain at all. The economy's growth in the current phase has been entirely driven by the services sector. However, employment in industry as well as employment in services has not kept pace with the decline of employment in agriculture. And particularly in services, where its share of GDP is now 57%, share of employment is only 30%, and most of it is in low value-added kind of services. The arguments around whether services can lead development in a labor surplus and low-skill economy like India are quite well known, and I'm not going to go into those arguments. And there are now important policy debates which reflect a real and growing concern that labor-intensive manufacturing has to be brought back to the center of the agenda. But these are basically the arguments and debates around the employment question as it pertains to urban poverty. But be that as it may, Karnataka and Bangalore particularly demonstrate the anomalies of services-led growth so far as employment is concerned. Now you can see here, I'm wondering if the slides are visible. Are the slides visible?
Yeah, they're visible.
Yeah, so you can see here that in Karnataka, the sectoral share in GDP, agriculture has steadily gone down. And the decline of industry and manufacturing in their respective shares in GDP, in GSDP. Whereas in services, the share has obviously gone up quite impressively. Now, when we compare with other, similarly industrially advanced states in the country, the comparative share of industry in GSDP, you can see that Karnataka is one of the lowest. In 2013-14, it was only 24%, whereas in Gujarat, it was 35%, Maharashtra 27%, Tamil Nadu 27%. Similarly, in manufacturing, Karnataka's share has been even much lower at 13% in 2013-14. And Gujarat, again, is much higher, so is Maharashtra, so is Tamil Nadu. So the decline of industrial employment in the state as a whole is quite conspicuous. And in Karnataka, the sectoral share in employment reflects this. So in primary, we have the decline from 68 to 50%. Secondary, we have an increase from 13 to 19%. And in the services sector, the increase is only from 19% to 31%. So essentially, what the takeaway from this is that while the service sector, in terms of its share in GDP, has grown quite phenomenally, the growth rate of employment has not kept pace with the growth in GDP share. And if large numbers remain confined to agriculture, even in a fast-growing state like Karnataka, this highlights the absence of employment opportunities in urban areas. Bangalore's experience has been more or less the same, or rather reflects the same characteristic features. That is the sectoral share in GDP. You can see registered manufacturing as consistently going down, secondary sector as consistently going down, while the services sector has obviously a very dramatic growth curve, and it is about 68.79%. Now, the sector-wise percentage of employment in Bangalore in the industry sector, it's 26%, whereas in the services sector, it's 73%. So obviously, employment is completely dominated by the services. Now, if we look at the distribution of the workforce, according to principal activity status in the Bangalore urban area, you can see that there is a rise in wage salaried employment from 48 to 55. And there is actually a very small rise in self-employment, and casual labor has gone down, so has unemployment. Now, the lesser space occupied by self-employment and casual labor in the workforce is very often hailed by policymakers in Karnataka as something which is, something to be celebrated. However, if we take a closer look at this, at the distribution of the workforce in urban areas in Bangalore, you can see that the wage salaried employment is more in Bangalore urban compared to urban India, about 55 and 42. However, the manufacturing sector is really low compared to urban India as a whole. So in a sense, trying to summarize this part is that the growth of services has not reflected growth in employment. And as will come out from the rest of my presentation, that it is really the quality of services, both in manufacturing and in the services sector, which is largely informal in nature and which underlines urban vulnerabilities. Just 1 minute. Now, to sort of give a more detailed picture of the industrial scenario in Bangalore itself, the decline of PSUs and of the SSI sector really kind of has not attracted enough research attention, but really to a certain extent underlines vulnerabilities of the urban working classes. The IT and ITES obviously is the epicenter of the city's economy. Currently, 40% of India's IT industry is located in Bangalore and accounts for 34% of India's total exports. So the city headquarters about 80% of the global IT companies which are currently in India. And out of 870 MNCs who have R&D centers in India, 700 are located in Bangalore. So it's really kind of a glittering picture as far as the presence of IT and ITS is concerned. Now, the setting up of software technology parks of Electronic City in Whitefield as state-of-the-art spaces to house the IT clusters, in a sense, bespoke a very close state-private sector collaboration, which underlines the prominence of IT in Bangalore, and particularly seen in the availability of subsidized land to IT companies. But even more interestingly, in the current scenario, as the startup initiative took hold, the IT-driven business model spread beyond Whitefield and Electronic City tech parks to older residential commercial localities, signaling the deeper penetration into the city of an emerging entrepreneurial consumer culture, now led by a new generation of young industry leaders. So no longer, Azim Premji and the Murthy's, but a new generation of industry leaders, many of whom who have come from other states or have recently returned from the USA and Europe. So it's kind of a different landscape in terms of who leads industry right now. So between 1993 and 1993-94 and 2011-12, the share of industry in the city's gross district domestic product, which is GDP, declined from 49% to 30%, and the share of services rose from 48% to 69%. So sector-wise employment figures are that industry is 26% and services is 72%, which I've already shown you. And wage salaried employment has gone up. Now, as service sector constitutes 73% of employment in Bangalore, one would assume that much of what is described as regular or salaried employment is to be found in the service sector. Now, the question then is, what is Bangalore's overall economic dynamism meant for the working classes? The study of lower class livelihoods in slums, not only in slums, in poorer sections of the city, highlights that actually there is no easy bridge between these lower class neighborhoods and the city's modern economy. And I will go a little faster now. See, what we have seen is that both construction and garment export sectors provide the largest employment for unskilled and semi-skilled labor in the city. The construction sector offers a range of compensations to unskilled, semi-skilled, and skilled labor. But what's important is that earnings remain tied to daily wages and the availability of work. The availability of work is never more than 3 to 4 days per week. During the pandemic, the fleeing of thousands of migrant construction workers revealed that the city provides no more than a subsistence connected to the availability of work. But while the pandemic highlighted this crisis, the crisis actually reflects what is the daily reality of the life of construction workers. Now, currently, we are also doing a large survey of women workers, global supply chain in apparel exports. And women workers are the majority of workers in this sector. And what we find, we've been tracking garment workers now for the last 15 years. What we find is that there is a minimum wage. There is a regulated wage board. There is a minimum wage, which is currently 12,000. We find that the majority of workers in the garment sectors who may have worked for more than 15 years do not earn more than 9,000 rupees per month, inclusive of Provident Fund and ESI, which is actually a huge violation of the minimum wage that in principle exists. So in practice, both in construction and in garments, in principle, these are regulated areas because there is a wage board, there is the possibility of collective action, and there is a minimum wage. But in practice, unregulated wages, uncertain tenure, and a largely ununionized workforce marks both sectors. And these are actually the largest sectors in the so-called organized sector in Bangalore. Now, a new class of service workers has actually emerged now, apart from the manufacturing sector, with education up to class 10 or 12, and working in Bangalore's vast and multiplying service domains, such as hospitality, entertainment, maintenance, housekeeping, security, so on and so forth. Now, service jobs, again, are typically associated with a monthly wage. However, Carol Upadhyay and I have a recent paper in the Third World Quarterly, which you might want to look at if you're interested, where we have pointed to the reality of precarious employment in this sector, defined by the classic features of informal work, that is, unregulated wages, again, uncertain tenure, and absence of insurance. So, on the other side of this, the so-called organized sector, that is manufacturing, construction, and the services. On the other side, the studies of lower class livelihoods in slums highlights that slum households lack access to skills and opportunities necessary to obtain a foothold, even in the lower rungs of the services sector. We've looked at peripheral slums, which are mostly housing recent migrants who are crowded into the construction sector and were mostly unskilled. Apart from these peripheral slums, which house new migrants, we have also studied old inner city slums, which house second and third generation residents. In the city's most densely populated commercial hub, for example, Lal Bagh, there are astonishing sites of stagnation and marginality. I want to mention just one case, that of Cement Hut slum, which is 70 years old, and where we find third generation of scrap collectors. This is mainly a slum of scrap collectors. Some only of very few have been pulled into organized scrap collection for companies. The rest, particularly women, children, and the elderly, remain tied to individual roadside collection, selling to whoever is willing to buy at the day's price, and with very little mobility. Only some have made it to service jobs. Most continue to work in traditional low-paying occupations, head load bearers, street sellers, petty shop owners, scrap collectors. So there is no easy bridge, as I have mentioned, between slums and the city's modern service economy. So in this sense, then, I see informality as a key concept that links different aspects of the reality of urban poor lives and livelihoods. In other words, whether you're looking at the so-called organized sector, the construction, garments, or services, or whether you're looking at someone who does head load bearing, it's really the lack of regulation which determines the vulnerability and precarity of their lives. There is, of course, a whole range here, and I don't have time to go into the range of regulation or lack of regulation which characterize different informal occupations, but degrees of regulation and organized activities certainly bring a modicum of security to low-income workers, while the complete absence of regulation greatly worsens their exposure to multiple vulnerabilities. Now, I would also like to mention, that mainstream literature makes a direct connection between migration, informality, and poverty. So I've already mentioned at the start of the talk that in this mainstream literature, mostly dominated by international organizations, it is the rural poor who carry their poverty into urban areas. My research actually led me to the location of poverty, as I have mentioned just now, in second or third generation slum households, who I have named the old poor, as well as in migrant settlements, who are the new poor. So migration actually is only a partial explanation of urban poverty. But the most critical issues which define urban deprivation are the flouting of minimum wage stipulations, irregular and insecure work, absence of work-related social insurance, and vulnerabilities relating to contract work across public and private sectors. So it's in that sense that the informal structure of work and earnings, stemming from the characters of the city's political economy, which holds the key to understanding the issue of urban vulnerability. I think I have very little time now, so I'll kind of rush through the rest. In terms of how do we conceptualize informality within broader paradigms of class or other kinds of activism, this is a challenge both for activists and theorists. I don't have anything particularly new to say, but looking at the literature, it seems to me that it falls into two distinct spaces. One is that a key theme which runs through the mainstream literature is that through supportive state policies and the facilitative role of NGOs, a significant element of inclusion of informal workers is possible through welfare. And this we have seen in the work of, for example, Ravi Kanwur, who has celebrated Seva by saying, why can't there be more organizations like Seva? It runs through the work of someone quite different, Partha Chatterjee, political theorist, anthropologist, who through his concept of the political society said that the poor are grouped around rights, making claims for welfare, and they're partially successful because the state must concede some of these claims, the democratic state. This is Partha Chatterjee in 2004 and 8. And this welfarist component has been taken up by large number of scholars, Reena Agarwal, who has shown in her work on bidi workers and construction workers that they now talk to the state for welfare rather than to private employees. Similarly, Rupa Nerelia has talked about the architecture of welfare. And it's interesting that most of these scholars are US-based or based in Western universities. All of this has been criticized, and I myself have done so in published papers as well as in my book. But we could come back to that later. But I would just like to say that while it looks rosy and it looks logical and coherent as an argument, much of it is not seen in practice. That is, the translation of welfare into the lives of workers is not really seen in practice. And I would just like to end by mentioning the work of Kalyan Sanyal, who stands in opposition to this whole discourse of inclusion. And Sanyal actually distinguished between two domains of the informal sector. The first are informalized employment practices, which are taking place within the circuit of capital as a result of globalization, increased competition, and so on. And second, which was Sanyal's point of departure from other work on informality, is that given the declining rate of growth of jobs in the manufacturing sector, even informal wage employment in industrial manufacturing has declined, which I have presented. And so for him, it is that huge numbers displaced from agriculture and other traditional occupations become self-employed. And given the nature of their operations, minimum capital investment, use of self or family labor, meager earnings, they are for the most part disconnected from the mainstream capitalist economy. So on the one hand, proletarianization is not occurring according to Sanyal, and on the other hand, this domain of self-employment, which he called the need economy, is a domain of structured exclusion. That is, these workers can never even hope to become what he called the, they can never even hope to become workers. They're not only not workers, they can never even hope to become workers in the Marxist sense of the proletariat. So it is some kind of a structured exclusion. Now, this has been critiqued on by many, and I just want to mention Vinay Gidwani's work, who points out that there are actually substantive links between the accumulation and need economies, that is capital and non-capital, as Gidwani termed it. And these links were important for Gidwani to underline. So I think it's important to understand that there is indeed a constant flux in the lives of informal workers in the in cities as they move from wage labor to self-employment. For example, from garment factories, women may move to home-based tailoring work, producing for garment factories, and in the latter capacity, they remain dependent on the accumulation economy or on the capitalist factories represented by the garment factories. But the same person may also decide to withdraw from these links and engage in part-time tailoring at home, where she produces for her neighbors, or she may become a domestic servant. These transitions we're seeing all the time. So as these trajectories unfold in the life of one and the same person, her links to the capitalist economy are important to understand in Vinay Gidwani's sense. But it is really the tenuousness of those links which point towards the broad structure of exclusion. And I think Kalyan Sanyal's contribution stands out when we see this theory of exclusion not as happening uniformly or in every instance or in the life of a person from A to Z, but as structured exclusion of largest numbers in the broadest sense. And coming to the end of the presentation now, just wanted to say that to understand exclusion further, I think it's important to know that the so-called proletariat has actually receded further into the shadows. And what is being overlooked to some extent is the large and ever-expanding world of wage labor, now in the domain of informal and unregulated labor. So to understand this exclusion further, one needs to draw on the distinction between workers linked to the modern economy through salaried wage. For example, drivers, security guards, organized trash collection, retail sale, garment exports on the one hand, and others who remain tied to casual daily wage work, headload bearers, construction workers, etc. But salaried wage work in different domains may not get the minimum wage, security of tenure, or any other kind of social insurance. In that sense, their precarity actually matches those who are working as casual wage earners, who may not get work every day of the week, or the self-employed. So in a sense, then one can see a certain uniformity even amongst what seems to be a very highly diverse workforce. So therefore, whether we look at workers who flit between self-employment and wage work, or those who work for a daily wage, or those who receive a monthly salary, there is an element of incorporation exclusion, incorporation stroke exclusion, rather than pure exclusion, which possibly provides a more nuanced understanding of the situation of workers. And to conclude very quickly, while petty production is actually central to the urban poor, ever larger numbers of the urban poor are wage earners in an increasing variety of employment relations, which are informal and unregulated. So it may then be necessary to trace the multiple and diverse ways in which this wage relationship manifests itself outside the formal economy, and the insertion of this workforce, often at highly disadvantageous terms and conditions, in the evolving structure of manufacture and services in an increasingly globalized setting, calls attention to the economic structures and policies that anchored these inequities. I think I will stop now and take questions.
Thank you, Supriya. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So I've moved to this larger group.
Sure.
So in case you're trying to locate me and do some video.
Yeah.
So we thank you so much for that talk. We already have a bunch of questions, and I'm just going to call on these participants to speak. So Shilajit, do you want to go first, and then maybe Samiksha, and then Stephanie? And is it okay, Supriya, if we take a bunch of questions?
Yes.
If it gets too much, then just tell me and we'll limit it.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Shilajit, I'm just opening you your talk, mic, so you can um, unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, ma'am. Like I've been familiar with your work for last few years, and you have wonderfully put the informality in the central argument. And what I was wondering that while I was also doing a bit of research and field work on this informal laborers, even in Gujarat and parts of West Bengal as well. So I saw the high level of indebtedness and a kind of chronic problem of indebtedness amongst the workers, where they are indebted in their rural areas because of certain rituals and cultural obligations which they have to perform. On the other hand, in the urban areas also, because their survival is always at stake, while they are living in the slums or to the slum heads or the landowners, they are also indebted. So how did you see this problem of indebtedness as a chronic issue, which has kind of topped up in the whole vulnerable situation?
Thank you. So, Mukta, should I respond to this or we'll collect a few
I was
questions?
just hoping that
Yeah.
we can collect questions.
Yes.
So, Samisha, if you can unmute yourself.
Hello, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Ma'am, actually, like you were also speaking about Seva, I want to ask one question that I read Kraiswal and Pratap. They have written a critical view on Seva, and they say that it is functioning on the neoliberal agenda, and they have links with the US and Hillary Clinton and all that. They are the major funding agencies. So, ma'am, I want to ask that what should be the view of the trade union movement forward? For example, the traditional trade unions like C2, the who are affiliated to political parties, also criticize SAVE on this ground that it doesn't target the root of the capitalism. It doesn't organize workers on the ground that against the state. And Reena Agarwala also is writing that uh, workers are as you said, that workers are organizing not against the employers, but they are demanding citizenship rights from the state. So how do you see the labor movement going forward? Should we actually accept that informality is going to stay, or should we try to question it? What should be the labor movement do?
Stephanie, is your question linked, or should we just allow Supriya to take these two because they're both sort of looking at?
Yeah, I think my question is a bit different. So
Okay.
go ahead, Supriya, and I can wait.
Okay. Thanks, Shilajit, and sorry, I didn't get the name.
Samiksha.
Samiksha. Yes. Shilajit, so yes, of course, indebtedness is a huge issue. Given my, my constant engagement with the wage question, I have seen indebtedness as linked to, not only linked to it, but as a function of the fact that many of these workers don't get a decent living wage. However, as you rightly pointed out, both in rural areas and in urban areas, much of this indebtedness happens because of certain, social commitments which they have, or we've seen in the case of women workers in the garment sector, many fall into deep indebtedness because their husbands give up on a working life. They become, victims of addictions. They lose their jobs or they give up their jobs. The women, in order to, and this is something which we're seeing on an everyday basis as we engage with these workers, in order to sustain their husbands in their addictions and their joblessness, as well as to, keep the family going, children's education, house rent, so on and so forth. These everyday necessities underpin indebtedness perhaps in a more crucial way than what we see as conspicuous consumption or keeping up with Joneses or social commitments, so on and so forth. So yes, of course, it's a huge issue and has been approached in many ways, in institutional interventions, other kinds of interventions, SHGs, so on and so forth. But like I said, given my close concern with the wage question, I really see it as part of the whole life and livelihood of these informal workers. That would be sort of a partial response to your question. Samiksha, the question
Thank
of
you.
seva, I would not directly address seva as an organization. Firstly, because I don't know that much about it. And secondly, because I understand that even given the challenges and criticisms that seva has faced, the kind of work that it has done has added enormous value to their members' lives. Whether seva can be criticized as a trade union which does not inspire its workers or mobilize its workers to engage with the state or with their employers, I think there might be something flawed in this question, because does seva see itself as a trade union in the conventional or traditional sense? Or does seva see itself as more as addressing the needs of self-employed workers, their credit requirements, their requirements to address their everyday needs through these local credit societies which were set up, so on and so forth, rather than to mount a whole-scale challenge to the state or to private employers, so on and so forth. So I'm not sure about where, just because I don't know seva enough. But my guess is that seva itself perhaps would not want to be judged by the parameters of traditional trade unions. Having said that, I would point out to you that the traditional trade unions themselves, you mentioned the C2, I think, their role in organizing informal workers has been quite problematic. For example, we see very little engagement with global supply chain workers. We see, very measured engagement with women workers. So in that sense, I think your question is broad, well-meaning, and is articulated in the broadest sense to how should the trade union movement look at the informal sector workers. But when we come down to the broad realities of specific engagements, like these two organizations which are at different poles, seva and C2, we find that the engagement has been very varied, just because their roles have been differently conceptualized.
Can you answer the last part of the question, that how these
is informality going to stay? That was your last question.
How they should take the labor movement forward, like because informal sector is going to stay into that, or we should get rid of it.
See, it's a really big question, whether informality is going to stay or not, and whether how the trade union movement, there is no trade union movement, there are large number of trade unions, how they should take forward the labor movement. I think the informal sector itself is deeply challenging to any trade unionist or to any trade union organization. If you look at the new Indian trade union initiative, I think I don't have the right words, but that it would seem to me to be ideologically and intellectually sort of occupying a space which is in a sense a challenge to the traditional trade unions, right? Because they're looking at a different constituency, they have a wholly different approach to informal sector workers, and they see informal sector workers as central to the labor force, which they are. Now, I think the most important challenge for other trade unions, more established ones like the C2 or the INTUC, is how does one handle the differences, the diversities between permanent workers, contract workers, wage workers, apprentices, interns, so on, for the hugely diversified classes of labor, to borrow a word from I can't remember which theorist has used this word recently. So this hugely diversified labor force, I think that is the biggest challenge. How does one conceptualize which category of labor should be at the forefront, should be leading from the front, and can at all one conceptualize such a category? So I'm afraid I don't really have a satisfactory answer to your question, but to some extent, I've tried to answer this in the last part of my talk, where I said that salaried wage workers are actually increasing in number. And while they share certain disadvantages with other kinds of wage workers, like casual workers, for example, there is a certain uniformity amongst salaried wage workers who are in the so-called organized sector, but who bear the classic features of informality. And I feel that the first step perhaps could be taken towards unifying, these salaried wage workers across manufacturing and services, and who share a lot of the, not only the disadvantages of labor, but of disadvantages of urban alienation, particularly of migrant workers. And all of these perhaps would come together in a new discourse and politics and constituency of labor.
Thanks, Supriya. Stephanie, do you want to go next, and Rituraj after that? I know that you've left something in the Q&A, left a question in the Q&A. So Stephanie, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Supriya, for a very clear presentation. But I wanted you to elaborate, if you can, on what you mentioned in the abstract about this new binary between the old poor and the new poor. And in your presentation, you have, of course, elaborated on the new contours of informality. But what could be, or what are the other characteristics of the new poor? And I was wondering, in particular, if you refer to the debate on the middle class and the new middle class, works by Lila Fernandez, in which the new middle class is conceived as having an economic basis, of course, which is different from the old middle class, but also in terms of aspirations and values, which may be different. So I just wanted to know more about the new poor and how you relate that, if at all, to the concept of the new middle class.
Should I answer Stephanie now, or should we wait for?
I think
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just unmuted Rituraj. Rituraj, are you here? Can you ask your question as
well? Sure. Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. My question was more regarding with how much of a role housing is played in intensifying the exclusion and the poverty, in the sense that slums haven't been notified, they don't have usual tenured property rights, and there's also a housing shortage in Bangalore, which a lot of economists write about. So how much has that played a role in kind of intensifying and furthering the exclusion, or that's just a very small or incremental role? Thanks.
Supriya, I think you can go ahead.
Okay, fine. Yeah, so both are very, large and important questions. Stephanie, so yeah, I didn't have time to elaborate on the old poor and the new poor, but the new poor we are looking at mostly in terms of migrants who have come to the city 0 to 10 to 15 years, not more than 15 years, and who are found predominantly in the peripheries of the city. They are more or less uniformly crowded into unskilled construction work because they have no skills, they have no education, About 85% of them were found to be illiterate when I first did my survey some years back. I term them as the new poor because they have newly arrived into the city. So I think this is a very different newness than what Leela Fernandez is talking about in terms of the new middle class. We found that most of them live in these self-constructed tenements, highly fragile, in completely unserviced neighborhoods. So in other words, while slums in the inner city areas are notified, that is, they can lay claim to certain services, the peripheral slums, which house migrants, new migrants, cannot claim any services at all, are constantly under risk of eviction. But perhaps most importantly, from the perspective of your question, they retain very strong links to their rural bases. They have left parts of their families, sometimes even children, back in their rural homes. There is constant traffic between their rural homes and these urban tenements where they live. This is one thing, that they do not see themselves in terms even of their everyday aspirations as part of the urban working class or as part of the urban citizenry. The second thing is that they don't exercise their voting rights in the city. Their voting rights are exercised back home, so they go back during election time, and they're often paid to go back during election time. So since they don't have election cards, voter cards, or BPL cards relevant to their current place of existence, they don't even claim to draw the ration from the fair price shops. So in a sense, the peripheral spatial existence kind of reflects their complete isolation and alienation of the city on different counts. Low incomes, no access to services, no access to cheaper goods through the ration shops, no right to vote, and no participation in civil society. And which is what I wanted to end with, is that we found no trace of civil society or NGO participation or engagement in these peripheral slums. So in that sense, they constitute a category one could say as non-citizens, because they're here only to earn a living, a very, very subsistence living. The old poor, on the other hand, are those found in inner city slums, which, as I've said, have been in existence for 60 to 70 years and house second or third generation residents. Many of them have made the move towards higher incomes. They work as service workers in clubs, restaurants, or they are auto drivers. They may even be taxi drivers, so on and so forth. What came out of the study was that this bridge between the slums and the modern sector of the economy is not that has been systematically built by state policies or by any other efforts, private sector, corporate sector, NGOs, or so forth, but is really a result of incidental or accidental factors. Someone may have accidentally or by chance met someone who has connections with a local club or restaurant and got a job there and moved up, or happened to get do a course in computers, or another person whose father was in the public sector who died an untimely death and he was taken into that organization, so on and so forth. So I'm saying that the movement from low income to slightly higher income services, which Anirudh Krishna has also mentioned in his recent book on Bangalore, this movement is not systematic, not the result of policy efforts or any kind of a collective movement, but remains very incidental. On the other hand, we find the largest numbers confined to very low income occupations, like headload bearing in the city market area, where they don't even get work every day, where the income is completely at the mercy of of the shop owner or the truck owner, so on and so forth, or garbage picking. There could be a whole range of functions. It could be as low as, a woman picking up a few stale vegetables from the local market and selling it on one of the roads in the slum. So these we have termed as the old poor, because they have not only remained residents in the city for 2 to 3 generations, but because they are participating in occupations which are traditional, which are very low paying, and which are completely unregulated. So I don't know if I have answered your question, but yeah, so the new poor, there's no connection to the new middle class, as I said, which Leela has written about. Housing. This is, really important, because housing is one of the issues of urban precarity, which governments have tried to address in a big way. And coming down from the UPA to the NDA, there have been these Awas Yojanas, which are not that different in quality actually across political parties. But let me say in brief that the urban poor housing question, the policies addressing urban poor housing share one important theme, that is the public-private participation. In other words, the government invites large builder companies to participate in poor housing construction. The mechanism for this is to make subsidized land available to them, to these large builders, who are supposed to build subsidized housing for the poor in one part of the land and to use the other part for commercial purposes. So understandably, there is huge competition to get this land. This paradigm of public-private participation makes the poor even more vulnerable in terms of their landlessness, because the government then has the right to evict the poor from this land, from a particular piece of land, by saying this land is going to be developed, and finally you will get a part of it by being offered subsidized housing. However, it is the government which decides who is entitled, which slum household is entitled, what is going to be the cutoff point in terms of considering a slum household's entitlement, so on and so forth. In other words, again, to cut it short, it brings a huge amount of discretionary power of the state to confront the powerlessness of the slum household. And it also brings, as we all know, the huge greed and lust of private property developers to bear on the question of urban land. So yeah, it's a huge thing, but to answer your question, the other part of your question also is that we have seen that even when governments succeed in building houses for the poor, these don't really address the issues of the poor, because these are usually high-rise apartments. Urban poor or slum dwellers typically combine life and livelihood in their ground floor rooms which they have in the slums. Small shops, livestock, so on and so forth, vegetable selling. Once these large high-rises come, the livelihood thing is completely thrown out. And we have seen that these high-rise apartments don't have civic infrastructure, for example, water, sanitation, garbage collection. All of this is promised, but it never works out. So we have looked at large housing projects in Lagere, for example, Mahadevpura in Bangalore. And all of these show the same symptoms of rapid decline and great state inattention.
Thank you, Supriya. Pushpa, did you want to ask a question as well?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, Supriya. Thank you very much for that thoroughly researched and well-presented talk. I am sure you had a lot more information that you have not been able to share because of lack of time. So perhaps you could fill in on 2 of such points. I'm sure you have information. So going beyond the conceptual discourse on formality, informality, and what will happen to the informal sector, what should be done, these are very big questions. But I am referring to 2 areas that are probably gray areas between formal and informal sector. And this is greater increasing engagement of informal type workers in the formal sectors. And this could be through contracts, subcontracts, piece rate work. And this is also to avoid the social benefits and due wages to be given to the formal sector workers. And this number is increasing as far as I know in the urban sector in India. So in Bangalore, what is your assessment or observation of this kind of employment pattern first? And the second is, you didn't give much attention to gender dimension of informal sector work, and I'm sure you have a lot of information. And women workers in the informal sector are even more disadvantaged than general informal sector workers. So do you have any observations and suggestions in this respect? So these are 2 questions. The bordering area of informality in the formal sector and gender dimension of informal sector work. Thank you.
Thank you. Mukta, are we going to
I just wanted to know, I have 6 people in this room with me. Does anyone have a question to add right now? After that? Okay, so I'll just add to Pushpa's question myself by asking, this distinction between the old and the new poor that you are making and the circularity or the sort of intermittent engagement with the city that you're pointing out with the new poor. Are we also, I mean, I know that you've done survey work and the sort of ongoing engagement with multiple field sites. Are we also sort of, do we have a clear sense in Bangalore of whether there's a caste or tribe kind of, I mean, social identity component here, which could deepen these distinctions and actually prevent the new poor from becoming the future old poor? And I'm coming at this because my interest is in migration and urbanization, and I'm hearing from a lot of field organizations who are tracking this through COVID and after COVID, that they have a sense that it's becoming increasingly harder for these new poor to hope to become the future old poor in these large metropolitan cities, though there may be some avenues in smaller urban areas. So I'm coming from sort of that feedback that I'm getting. Is it, and conjecturing that, are you seeing other axes of exclusion or disadvantage other than the fact that, why is it that they get stuck in these, other than the fact of literacy and education that you've pointed out, and intergenerationally, would that change or would they be stuck for other reasons? So that's my question.
Okay. So going back, thank you. Going back to Pushpa's question about the gray areas between the formal and the informal. This is something that we have looked at. Again, to be brief and to go back to the specifics of Bangalore that you asked me about, the presence of the formal in the informal is increasingly emerging. And we have seen this happening in the public sector particularly. Not only, for example, in the increasing incorporation of contract workers into public sector manufacturing. By law, manufacturing is not in the public sector is not supposed to employ contract workers, but increasingly they're doing that. And the divide between permanent workers and contract workers in terms of interests, in terms of compensations, so on and so forth, is very clear. So that gray area is very clear in public sector manufacturing companies. Even when, for example, the state is building the metro, right, in Bangalore, the state contracts this out to private companies. the private companies engage contract workers at different levels of contractual norms. Some are protected to some extent, some are completely not protected, no accident insurance, no injury insurance, so on and so forth. So when large numbers of workers become victims of an accident and are not paid any kind of insurance and compensation by the company that is directly employing them, the state, in a sense, is participating in this informal practice of employment. So those are sort of the gray areas, the not so good gray areas of the formal and the informal. Within the private sector, we're seeing a large number of workers who are working not only as not only as employers of a particular company, but the lines between, and they may be getting just less than the minimum wage, but they're getting ESI or Provident Fund. So there is an area of incorporation or inclusion into formal employment. But the same women, because of the wages that they earn, they are working overtime, and there is no stipulated payment for overtime in global supply chains. They may not even work overtime in the same factory. They may go home and work for another factory as a home-based worker. They may do flower selling. They may do domestic work. So what I'm saying is that as in the public, similarly in the private corporate sector, the formal and the informal intermesh very, very closely. But it's really the informality part of it, the lack of regulations, which determines the vulnerability of these workers. So I don't know if
you are spot on.
Okay, so that's about what I wanted to say about the formal and the informal. Your second question was on gender. So, of course, gender plays a huge role in reinforcing vulnerabilities. There is no doubt about that. And I would say again that my focus on gender has been within the larger framework of work and workers. And we have found that both in terms of their everyday lives within the household, their lives in the factories, and the livelihoods that they earn in the factories, there is enormous disadvantage and disprivilege, if one can use such a word, that they experience as workers. So it is not only low wages, but it is sexual harassment. It is not only sexual harassment, it is extreme coercive behavior of shop floor supervisors, often amounting to physical coercion or physical violence. These are recorded on an everyday basis to us who are surveyors, to committees within the factory, to trade unionists who are working with global supply chain workers. Unfortunately, and this goes back to the question asked by someone else on the future of trade unions. Unfortunately, there is really no bridge, again, if one can use such a word, which can carry this discourse of discontent and almost of agony of women workers from the factories and the homes to the discourses, ideologies, and politics of trade unions. So yes, of course, in answer to your question, gender is a huge factor in reinforcing precarity, but yeah.
Thank you.
So Mukta, your question, again, very broad and very important, and I would have liked to have more time to reflect on it. But the new poor, why they may or may not be incorporated into a more sustained citizenship or worker status within the city. It's a question of the work that is available. The work that is available to them is, as I have said, in terms of unskilled labor, and it's also a question of space because they're spatially excluded. But on the other axis of exclusion, which is as you've said, caste, community, tribe, so on and so forth. I have to admit that I have not looked into the caste question in depth, and my work has been criticized always for not being sensitive enough to the caste question. It is not so much a question of not being sensitive enough as I have seen caste as a singular disadvantage, but work as determining the disadvantage in a more intensified way. So in my perspective, if education and work and decent work had been available, and we still found large numbers of lower caste communities outside, excluded from that system, one could certainly be more attentive to caste as an enduring disadvantage, which of course it is. But all I'm saying is that I have not looked deeply into caste as a singular factor of disadvantage in these new poor communities. But I also have to say that, to some extent, just one sec, I want to replug my laptop. Sorry. So the other thing I wanted to mention was that, we assume that these isolated and excluded communities, especially excluded communities in the peripheral slums, we assume that they would want or aspire for a higher degree of inclusion within the space of the city. I'm myself beginning to be slightly skeptical about that. I think they would obviously aspire for greater economic exclusion or greater economic benefits or social benefits. Whether they actually want to become city dwellers in the sense of being, incorporated as the old poor in the slums, that remains a question. I think the ties to rural areas still very strong, and the pull to go back remains very, very strong. The pandemic highlighted this in highlighting the rural home as a space of care, as Al-Pasha has pointed out, with which one may or may not agree. I don't actually agree that it is a space of care, but it certainly became a sort of a resort in the last instance. I'm currently doing some work on the Sundarbans in West Bengal, particularly looking at migration. And we are finding that while both climate change and economic backwardness push members of families to migrate, the universal understanding seems to be that this is going to be a temporary migration or cyclical migration. The small surveys that we have done, almost universally, they have responded that they do not want to live in the city. So anyway, my work there is still in the very starting stages, but I'm just trying to say that the new poor need to be understood more in terms of the context from where they're coming, the cultural, social context from where they're coming, rather than what we would think should be, logically their economic aspirations for urban inclusion.
Thank you, Supriya. That's very well taken. I think Rituraj had a question around the Aadhaar. So Rituraj, if you want to ask that first, and then I'll hand over to Partho, who has a question as well.
Sure. My question is specifically with Aadhaar, which is something I've seen with a lot of Bengali migrant workers within Bangalore itself, where what happens is like they're excluded from a lot of welfare schemes and a lot of deliveries, because of lack of Aadhaar or like just Aadhaar not being applicable in certain situations. How much is that played into, like, for all migrant workers? How much is that played into exclusion? And furthering, like you mentioned, how in London, even though there's informal work, there are a lot of universal benefits that one can avail, as where that doesn't exist in India, and the benefits that exist come through Aadhaar, and that itself, does it get exclusionary for migrant workers, or does it extend beyond that?
Mukta, should I answer this first?
Go ahead.
Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. So, I haven't studied Aadhaar in itself in great detail. I would say that the availability of welfare to migrants, while it is there, of course, in principle and in paper, is greatly determined by the, by the question of whether there are civil society organizations mediating between these communities and the state. So the state as giver of welfare, these communities as receivers, and the NGOs as mediators. As I have said in my presentation, we saw very little civil society initiative in these migrant slums, and part of the reason was, they're spatially they're far away. Part of the reason is just lack of interest, lack of resources, so on and so forth. But also that many in these slums are not even aware of, for example, a widow pension. A widow pension, which is paltry, it's been increased recently from 400 to 600, but could make a huge difference to someone who has no access to any other income. But they're not aware of it. Those who are aware of some welfare benefits are not able to fill in the forms. They don't know where to get the forms, so on and so forth. So it is that institutional complex of welfare which works so well in advanced industrialized countries like the UK or Northern Europe, where both government and civil society proactively make welfare available to citizens. Here it is really just the opposite, where we find a huge kind of a wasteland between the need for welfare on the one hand, and the government proposes welfare legislation, which are wide-ranging and many in number. But the gray area is that there isn't an institutional and there isn't any kind of institutional capacity to distribute this welfare to targeted groups. And migrants are the major sufferers in this scenario.
So in that sense, like, does the presence of universal benefits without like barriers help in those aspects?
I think I couldn't hear your question.
So I meant like in that aspect, are you saying that if the benefits were universalized, like if there was universal benefits, those kind of problems would almost go away in some form?
If the benefits were universalized, I'm talking more about the absence of institutional capacity to execute welfare. So the benefits may be universalized, but we would have the same institutional handicaps in terms of the state machinery, as well as in terms of civil society activists in taking that welfare to citizens.
Understood. Thank you.
Thanks, Supriya. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Thanks, This is Partho. I was just actually 3 levels of questions. I was just checking to see if something comes through. And it's the first is sort of related to this distinction between incorporation and exclusion that you sort of make. And during the Q&A, I think I got a better sense of it, but it would be nice to sort of also elaborate a little bit on it. So when you said about the fact that almost universally a lot of your survey residents, survey respondents did not want to stay in the city, were you sort of alluding to that aspect of incorporation? So do you think about incorporation when the person wants to, in some sense, become a part of the city, and whereas exclusion is more a city process? whereas incorporation is more a decision of the individual in some sense. Is that a good way of thinking about it? It may not be, so some clarity on that process. The second is related to the old poor story, and I mean, you have been in panels with him, and you've interreferenced each other's work. So Anirudh's work on that space, and I'm pushing you to sort of get a sense of, when you think of the old poor, there's of course caste, and people like Selvaraj would sort of Selva would actually sort of talk about formal peripheralization as related to the caste kind of story. But is it the case that among the old poor, do you see the ability to take advantage of the changing economic structure of Bangalore? In the sense that it was and still is a very large garment hub, and the garment is driven, as you said, by a relatively more gendered workforce and also a migrant story. The IT story is also driven very much by a migrant story, but of a completely different character. But do you see among the old poor a greater engagement with the IT sector? Need not necessarily be, they may not be the IT programmers, but are they facilities managers who work in IT firms, which then transforms the nature of their employment in some sense, from more into a more sort of secure kind of structure. And finally, again, sort of focusing on this transitional story, what is your sense about, so what about the nexus of education and opportunity, and especially public education and opportunity, in a sense that in some of the other work, and as you said about whether you bring your family to the city or not, a lot of the issue is, if I do bring my family to a city, my child would have to study in the local public school, because my ability to sort of meet the expenses of living in the city and school fees and structure that is not, my income doesn't allow that. Whereas if I'm remitting funds back home, then the person has the ability to study in the rural private school, and the rural private school may actually in some sense provide a better quality of education in their minds compared to the urban public school. And in your interactions, do you see this issue come up, and do you see the quality of public education in a city like Bangalore as a significant obstacle in this incorporation process and the ladder climbing process? I'm sorry it was so long, but hopefully the three questions were separate and articulate. All yours.
Thank you. Three difficult questions, if I may say so. But the incorporation exclusion that I was talking about in the presentation was in response to the literature on structured exclusion, which Kullan Chanal had generated, and Gidwani's response to it, or critique of it, that informality does not represent pure exclusion, that there are elements of floating between the formal and the informal, between petty self-employment, casual labor, etc., wage labor, so that we don't really have the kind of a pure conception of the informal as excluded which Sanyal would have us believe. And many have, accepted this criticism. So my response to that was in saying that we really not aspiring for or asking Kullan Sanyal for a pure abstraction, but the essence of his contribution was to look at exclusion as structured. There may be partial inclusion in a person's life, but exclusion is structured because it is coming from the nature of the political economy. So in that sense, incorporation stroke exclusion. Now, what your question does is to take this incorporation exclusion binary or sort of the package to the realm of incorporation exclusion within the city as a space, as far as the new poor are concerned. Now, and this kind of goes back to Mukta's question also, that what determines exclusion or incorporation? And of course, it is the larger political economy, which, separates out, in a sense, the unskilled as very low wage earners. And because these are migrants who live on the peripheries, they do not have access to the old slums, because the old slums are rented or owned spaces, which people have been living there for generations, or somehow have access to those. So the spatial exclusion reinforces the economic exclusion of the unskilled migrant labor. Now, whether it can finally lead to incorporation, and that's where I think your question ties in with Mukta's, and which I was trying to explain, is that not just in my work in the Sundarbans, which I referred to earlier, where we're seeing a kind of resistance to the idea of permanent movement to the cities. But even when we have done surveys in other parts of Karnataka, particularly North Karnataka in the backward districts of Raichur, we have seen that there is a certain interest and aspiration to find a good job in the city, to make money, but then to come back to the village, to expand the house or to buy more land, perhaps to even buy a car and employ a taxi driver, somehow to consolidate and improve one's life in the village rather than a wholesale movement to the city. So in that sense, the incorporation exclusion argument becomes much more complex when you transpose it to the context of the peripheries, to the rural, the urban periphery, and the inner city slums. If we're seeing that as a continuum. So that's the first one. The second is, do the old poor have an ability to leverage the IT sector? Certainly. I mean, in presentations, one is bound by time, and one ends up by drawing a very, very dismal picture, which is the predominant picture. But certainly there are slums from where we have seen people moving into occupations like working as sales girls in cash counters, as receptionists, as young boys working as computer service people after a minimal amount of training and experience or internship. So certainly there is some kind of incorporation happening in that sense. There is a lot of interest. If you talk to the younger generation, let's say the 20 to 30 age group in inner city slums, they all want to become computer people, and they all want to have an office with a computer in that office. That's really what they want. So that remains the aspiration and the image of prosperity. And there is certainly an effort. But what I have done is to try and say why it is not happening, why the bridge is so frail, or why the bridge is just not there in most cases. And this obviously is linked to your final question on the quality of public education. Again, I haven't looked at schools, corporation schools, government schools in low-income areas, which I really want to at a future date. So I would not be able to say anything substantively on it. But the link between education and jobs, which is obviously very fragile because people are dropping out, youngsters are dropping out at a very early age, class 8, class 10, class 12. This was the situation which was supposed to have been addressed by the Skill India policy. And that whole ecosystem of skills training centers and institutions which came into being post the Skill India policy was actually supposed to address this vacuum, that enough education is not happening in these schools. These people are not really ready to take up jobs. Jobs are there according to the government, so on and so forth. So let the skill centers do their work. And as I mentioned, Karen and I have done this research on skill institutions in Karnataka, both Bangalore and North Karnataka. And what we found was not just the inadequacy of skill centers in terms of giving the right kind of skills to get the right kind of jobs in terms of their aspirations, but that these skill centers are working to produce a laboring class for the service sector. So the service sector in cities requires a semi-skilled labor force with some degree of familiarity with English and computers, who they can then employ at low wages with absolutely no security of tenure, no social insurance, etc., etc. And this is what the skill centers are plugged into. This is what they are really producing. So we see a huge amount of what's it called? Of going in and going out of jobs. An enormous amount of migration, of reverse migration back to the villages, because the kind of employment that they're finding in cities after they have been trained by the skill centers is not adequate to give them a city life. And so in a sense, we pointed both to the inadequate conceptualization of what is the purpose of skilling, but we also point to the fact that these are indeed the jobs which are available. And these jobs are essentially informal and unregulated in nature. And this is what skills are plugged into. So, I mean, in answer to your final question, I went a little beyond the public education question that you raised, which is absolutely central, because I don't have that much information on public education and its relationship to urban poverty. But in a sense, I kind of extended it to what has been the policy response to the fragility of public education in Bangalore. I don't know if that answers any of your questions.
Just a quick thing. Did you see a lot of your respondents sending their children, if they had them, to the local public school, or were they use? I mean, not so much the quality of the education, just looking at the choices made by your respondents.
Yeah. The choice uniformly was private English medium school, uniformly. Whatever be the quality of the private English medium school. Obviously, they could not, access the better schools even through RTE. But, local, very low quality, low standard, but private English medium schools. In the peripheral slums, the new poor, if they had the children with them, had no option but to send them to the government schools.
Thanks. There'll be one more question coming your way. Just.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
A very good evening, and thanks for your time and knowledge. That's really helpful for us. Actually, ma'am, I was thinking about the fact that, sorry, ma'am, I'm Sarthak, and I'm basically a student. I've done my graduation in BCom, and I'm pursuing I'm preparing for civil services. So I just wonder, when I go here and there, it's a very general and practical question. Like wherever these informal workers are there, like construction workers, or you can see even petty vendors, you can see or even sweepers, and the people who are involved with MNREGA, especially in urban areas. So their living lifestyle, or the way they are living, basically in terms of necessities, basic necessities, is not at all good, and they are not aware of that, basically. So that brings me to the point that I feel like we people are enjoying much more benefits as compared to them, as compared to the people who are migrating from their respective areas to the urban city, be it Delhi, Bangalore, or Kolkata, anywhere metropolitan city. But I feel that the trickle down approach, where we think that if we develop a particular section of society, or a particular section of place where if we are thinking of developing only a particular section in our country, so that is the, because we thought that this would bring trickle down the benefits from the upper class to the lower class. But this is the very major reason where the problem lies. So what is the take of this trickle down approach? Like, what is your take on this? Like, if we just bring down this very notion of developing a one particular section of society, like we can just develop every section of society, we can think of that. This will stop the migration also, and the informal, basically the existence of informal sector. So what is your take on this? How can we stop it?
Thank you, Swartak. And I think you're spot on that trickle down doesn't really work. I would say very briefly that in the case of Bangalore, we find that, the enormous expansion of IT wealth, and not just ITES, and all the, the high-end services associated with the new businesses that have developed in Bangalore, have had a huge spillover effect in the city in terms of extending the services sector. Like I mentioned, hospitality, huge hotels, malls, multiplexes, medical services, name it and you have it. And this has opened up wide vistas of employment for the so-called working classes. So in a sense, if one can conceptualize spillover as trickle down, yes, certainly it has happened. Trickle down is a wider concept with a sort of a more more normative implications than spillover, and that has obviously not happened not just in Bangalore but in other cities in India or the global south, for precisely the reasons which I have mentioned in my talk.
Good evening, ma'am. I am Priyanka from Delhi University. I have completed my MA and I have just qualified my JRF. I'm looking forward for applying PhD. And my research interest area in women in construction workers especially. And ma'am, I want to know from you that as we know that women in every informal sector are in very precarious situation as compared to men. So in construction sector, there are very few women, as we know from the data, that women are very low in construction sector as compared to other informal sectors like manufacturing and other activities, vendors, as women are more self-employed as well. So my question is that whether there are scope of, because we consider construction sector as a after agriculture as a modernized sector in which there are many construction works is going on in the urban sector specifically. So women should as women should withdraw from that sector, or there should be state intervention or corporate social responsibility, so that they should be sustained here as they move from rural area into my urban area, so that they can get or sustain their livelihood. So ma'am, what are the research approaches or policy initiatives should be there so that they can be sustained in this sector and have a decent life and wages? Thank you, ma'am.
See, the regulation of wages in the construction sector has not really been successful, and it differs from state to state. One thing, and the other thing is that the wage board, the social welfare boards which have come up in the construction sector as a result of national level legislation as well as state level legislation, even these, many of them sit with large amounts of accumulated money but are not able to disperse these for the welfare of the construction work. So women construction workers are part of the whole construction worker workforce, and to that extent suffered the same disabilities which the construction workforce suffers in general. Of course, they have they get lower wages because their work is different, so on and so forth, and just because they are women workers. I don't think in the present scenario it makes sense to advocate that women from rural areas should come to urban areas and be incorporated into the construction sector, because I personally see it as a space of great physical labor, hard physical labor with very little remuneration. And women suffer more as a result of these factors. So I wouldn't really advocate it.
Thank you so much, Supriya. I don't think we have any more questions. They were very difficult, very varied questions that were thrown at you today. I've checked. It's just Pushpa's additional response to him. Yeah, I mean, if you have any last words, any reflections, it was really great having you here. And now you know why this feels more like a workshop than a presentation.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
His question to me was, why is it called an urban workshop when you're asking me to present for 40 minutes, 45 minutes? So I was tempted to say, you'll see, but I attempted an explanation.
Yeah. No, well, no last words. I just want to say that I really appreciated the questions, learned a lot, and I hope I will have an opportunity to, have further interactions in this kind of forum. Maybe next visit to Delhi.
Yes, absolutely. You should just drop in and we can curate a smaller group with more difficult and more intense questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And thank you everyone for being here. As usual, we will, all of this is available on the Facebook Live for those of you who want to go back and look at it. And CPR will also put out a recording on its YouTube channel soon. And thank you for joining us, and see you next month. Thank you so much, Supriya.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.